Before we get into the details of how Ray criticizes Schellenberg's arguments about divine hiddenness, I should mention that I'm getting this primarily from his book titled The Hiddenness of God. It's an Oxford University Press book, as well as some conversations with Mike. So as we're looking at the argument itself, the Schellenberg's argument, the main way that Ray attacks this is by criticizing premise 2. So if you recall, premise 2 says, if there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. In other words, if we do have a loving God that's always open to a personal relationship, then there's not going to be anyone who, through no fault of their own, without resisting God, ends up not believing in God. And Ray has 3 arguments, as far as I can see, against the argument of Schellenberg. And the first argument goes like this. First of all, we establish that the hiddenness arguments assume that God has an idealized love for humans. Again, they're based kind of on a generic God, and Ray is careful to say that may not be what we're talking about when we're talking about the Christian God that we see from scriptures and from Revelation, broadly speaking. And so that's an assumption that the hiddenness argument relies on, but Ray is going to challenge that with this argument. So what is love, first of all? Well, Ray makes no attempt, of course, at defining it, but he says it does include the desire for the good of the beloved and the desire for union with the beloved. At least one of those two is necessary for love, and maybe both. So to have an attribute, though, in an ideal way is to remove relevant limitations on having the attribute. So we could talk about different things having an attribute, but to then talk about having an attribute in an ideal way seems to be that it would be limitless. So maybe think of existence, well, many things exist, but the limitless kind of existence might be necessary existence. That's just one potential example to illustrate that. So what would that look like with love? Well, ideal love then would include an unlimited desire for union with someone, or an unlimited desire for their good, or of course both unlimited love for them that includes both desires, and they would have to be held in balance with one another. So we'll take that for granted. And the desires also, if it's an ideal love, would be motivationally predominant. They're going to be the priority for the one who is loving. Now, it's doubtful that humans could survive limitless ideal love from God and maintain any personal autonomy. That's one problem here. If, for example, think of union, right? It would seem like if God's just overwhelming someone with union with him, then that's going to be a problem for personal autonomy. And if humans could not survive limitless ideal love from God and maintain personal autonomy, well, then God's love is not an ideal love for humans. It doesn't look like that would be the kind of love that God would have or does have for humans. So that's one issue. And then Ray develops another type of issue in this argument. To love someone with an ideal love in regards to both desires for goodness and for union seems to amount to a kind of worship, right? If that other thing, person, whatever, is the ultimate source of what you're seeking, you want its goodness for it, union with it, that seems to be a kind of worship. And of course, God does not worship humans, and nowhere in scripture would you see that described, encouraged, or suggested even. Thus, God's love is not an ideal love for humans. And so God does not have an ideal love for humans. Divine love is not ideal love. And thus we can conclude that premise 2 is false, because premise 2 assumes divine love is an ideal love. So that's the first argument against premise 2. Let's look at the second argument now. And here I've just make it a very abbreviated, and then we'll look at, of course, one of the premises needs a little bit of support. So God is genuinely and perfectly personal. God is a person. And Ray says that this is something that Christians would affirm, and it's clear in Scripture. And then premise 2, if God's genuinely and perfectly personal, then God's love for humans is not an ideal love. Now, it may seem odd to claim that, so we'll come back and we'll defend premise 2 in just a moment. But obviously, if you put these two premises together, you would conclude that God's love for humans is not an ideal love. And since that is assumed in premise 2, we have, of Schellenberg's argument, that is, we would have a problem then in Schellenberg's hiddenness argument. Okay, what about this argument's premise 2? Why would we say that if God is genuinely and perfectly personal, God's love for humans would not be an ideal love? Well, part of what it means for God to be genuinely and perfectly personal is for God to be someone with interests and desires and projects that are distinct from and not oriented around those of other people or other individuals. God would have a personality with interests outside of that individual. Think of just two persons a spouse love for their spouse. That if we have a person and they're going to have interests and desires that are distinct from their spouse, that are not completely oriented around their spouse. A person would be like that. And so that would be true of God as well. And having limitless devotion to human welfare, again, as having an ideal love implies, well, that's inconsistent with having interests and desires distinct from and not oriented around those of others. And that's why it seems we would say that if God's genuinely and perfectly personal, God's love for humans would not be an ideal love, which includes this kind of limitless devotion to human welfare. And that's assumed in Schellenberg's arguments and other hiddenness arguments. And again, so what we have, if divine love's not ideal love, then the hiddenness argument's based on a mistaken assumption about divine love. Okay, a third argument against the hiddenness argument that Ray provides, since God is not maximally devoted to our good, as we just argued in argument number 2 that Ray gave, there are no guarantees that hiddenness or suffering will be allowed for the sake of our ultimate good, rather than for the sake of some non-anthropocentric good. So some good that's not centered around humans, right? So this brings up the topic or the issue that I'll mention just briefly, the relationship between the hiddenness arguments and arguments from evil. Certainly if God is hidden and that causes suffering, you could see why, well, suffering, that would be evil. So this could be a subset of the argument from evil. But Ray argues, well, that's not quite right, because even if you could address fully the argument from evil, there still could be the problem of hiddenness. And so these do seem to be distinct categories, but it's not that significant of an issue. If you consider hiddenness as a subset of evil, that's okay. Still, the objections to the hiddenness arguments are going to be the same. So we have this, if God doesn't have that maximal devotion to our good, then suffering might be allowed for some sake other than for anthropocentric goods. And God is interested in maximizing God's own glory, we see from Scripture, even if it conflicts with human interests and includes hiddenness. And Ray refers to Old Testament passages that seem to support premise 2. And if 1 and 2 are true, right? So again, why is he referring to Old Testament passages? Just to be clear on this, we have to use revealed scripture in order to get a good idea of the kind of God we're talking about. And once we have the kind of God we're talking about clear, that's part of the reason why Ray thinks the hiddenness arguments don't work. Okay, so now, if 1 and 2 are true, then divine hiddenness does not have to serve greater human goods in order for God to be justified in permitting hiddenness or even bringing about hiddenness. And we continue on. If divine hiddenness doesn't have to serve greater human goods in order for God to be justified in permitting it or even bringing it about. And it should be noted for this argument then that we conclude there in 4, right? That 1 and 2 are also in the context. So it seems like, oh, God's too busy for humans. God's got his own projects. He can't be bothered with humans, right? So Ray says that needs to be kept in mind, that we want to balance those ideas with a couple other ideas. And first of all, God loved us so much to make the ultimate sacrifice through Jesus on the cross so that we might have a relationship with God. And so that's something that kind of balances, we might say, this idea of God having projects unrelated to human goods. And also, of course, God arranges for the suffering that he allows, that God allows. Again, Ray does never would use the masculine pronoun. I slip and do that sometimes. God arranges for the suffering that God allows to be defeated in the context of our lives. Now, that doesn't mean they are balanced out perfectly. But what that means is, being defeated means is that the bad things being included in some good enough whole to which it bears a relation of organic unity. So one's life as a whole is still good, even including that bad thing. And there's a relationship between the bad thing and the whole that gives that wholeness a unity. And that idea is from Marilyn McCord Adams. That's the MMA there, Marilyn McCord Adams. And Ray agrees with her on this idea. Now, going back to premises 1 and 2, again, we kept the context in mind of why God might have projects that aren't devoted to human welfare. But Ray considers possible reasons. Why would that be the case? Well, there's some possible support. Now, he doesn't affirm this. He claims that since God is transcendent, we really don't know, or at least he doesn't know what we might say here, but maybe one of God's projects involved interacting with humans on terms that suit God's personality better than our more desirable modes of interaction. Now, Ray says maybe this is unpalatable. Maybe we prefer, obviously, for God to interact with us on our terms, but that's not the way God interacts with us. Maybe God's projects include bringing us into a certain kind of relationship with God. And of course, what one aspect of that relationship naturally would seem to be a submissive relationship. So we see in scripture that God often talks about revealing himself to those who are submissive and willing to submit to him. Again, masculine pronouns are my responsibility, not Ray's. Maybe God's projects involve accomplishing non-anthropocentric earthly goals, as some read the book of Job to imply that God's got all these other things going on earth. And so humans are not quite the center of the earth that we think we are. Or, of course, the cosmos, broadly speaking. Or maybe God's projects inherently involve God's hiddenness for one reason or another. Exactly why, we may not know. So these are just suggestive, right? Suggestive reasons why God's personality and his interests and his projects may conflict with our goods and certainly are not on our terms. So that's broadly speaking. I'm covering a lot of material for Ray, and I'm sure that I have not included some very important parts, and maybe even not quite gotten his arguments correct on this. But that's Ray's response to these concerns about the hiddenness of God.